Hello, everyone. Welcome to Navigating India. And today we have with us Professor Rajshree Chandra to talk about her book, Competing Nationalisms, The Sacred and Political Life of Jagat Narain Lal, her own grandfather. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Rishi. Thank you for having me over, and thank you to Navigating India for giving me this platform. And it's a
Thank you, ma'am.
pleasure to join.
So, Professor Rajshree is an author, academic, and a teacher at the Janaki Devi Memorial College at Delhi University. And you actually work in the intersection of law, politics, and political philosophy. But the subject of today's discussion is something different, which is biography, which is not your genre, a historical
That's right.
biography, right? And that about your grandfather, right? Why did you choose this genre? First question. And the second question, which I would like you to address in the same, is this was not a kind of a biography about the man, the Jagat Narayan, but more of discussion of his ideas and how he evolved over time. His ideas evolved over time. So why did you choose this genre?
This is a question that I get very regularly. How come a political theorist and someone who's working at the intersection of law and politics in general and on intellectual property rights, how come I have veered towards not just history but very specific within history, the biographical genre? There comes a time in an academic or intellectual or scholarly journey when you get somewhat, you want to try something new, and you get a little, you want to take a break with the regular stuff that you're doing, and which is what I did. But the reason to specifically veer into writing on my grandfather actually was motivated by two things that simultaneously happened, and two very innocuous and seemingly small things. One, of course, was a scroll article which I read, titled "How the Founding Fathers of India Found the Principle of Secularity Nauseating." It was a clunkily worded title which I don't quite recall, but essentially it was about the abhorrence towards the principle of secularity that many founding fathers in the Constituent Assembly had. And one of the people cited in the article was my own grandfather. The article was published in 2015, but I only read it much later. And the reason for my reading it much later was because I was given a bunch of diaries, which was with my cousin Manish Sinha, who's also a professor at Magad University and has worked on Jagat Narayan Lal. And he passed on these diaries to me. And when I began going through these diaries, I found very rich material there. And one thing led to the other. I Googled my grandfather. I didn't find much except this article. And I cringed at the title of the article. And being a deeply secular person myself, I wanted to know more about why he abhorred and detested, as the article claimed, the principle of secularity. This is when, I began reading the diaries. And one page of the diary was very interesting because, and from the perspective of a political theorist, it was dated somewhat 1928, 1929, when he's requisitioning, he's in jail, he's serving charges of sedition, and he's requisitioned for certain books and articles. And the page is divided into two. On the top of the half of the page is Gita Rahasya. He's asked for Kane Upanishad, Isha Upanishad. And at the bottom of the page, there's a line that's drawn. There is Machiavelli, there's Bluntschli, there's Plato, there's Voltaire. And suddenly, the fact that there was this scholarly oeuvre that my grandfather was familiar with, that sort of, the prejudice that the scroll article had installed in me was given way by a newfound pride. And as I write in the book, pride and prejudice are fertile breeding grounds for learning to know about a historical figure. So that's how I started working in this area.
I mean, there must be two troubles, right? When you're writing about your own grandfather. First thing is you have to be sure it doesn't turn out to be a hagiography of just praising the man, right? That's one of the trouble. And second thing, the sense I get from your own work is that you are very different from your grandfather, right? For example, in your afterword of your book, you write, I quote, I'm too much of a rationalist to ever empathize with you, and you are too much of a spiritualist and a Vedantist to understand my mundane material questions. Stop quote. Right in a formal letter that you're writing to your grandfather. And another sentence in the same afterword is you say, quote, I still lack sympathy for your nationalist vision that use religion to sacralize politics or even fashion a political self. Stop quote. So, how did you navigate through these differences?
I don't know if I've told you this, but this book came out of the New India Foundation. So I had gone for an interview, and there was Ram Guha, Nirja Jayal, Srinath Raghavan asked me the question, exact same question, that how will you maintain a certain distance between your grandfather and yourself, between his political beliefs and your political beliefs? Will there be a tendency to whitewashing? And at that time, I did not quite have an answer of how to go about it or how to do it. When I began writing this, I was acutely aware of the fact that there is not just an ideological distance, but also a temporal and a spatial distance between us. In some senses, that helped. The fact that I do not have a memory of him. I did not interact with him. I did not have a emotional bond with him. Helped me to have a very objective gaze on him. It was almost like an outsider who was. And I began with, dare I say, a little bit of a conceit that my own sense of secularity and my own liberal moorings will enable me to have a tolerant gaze on my grandfather, on Jagat Narain Lal. And I'll come to this later, but, I write in the last chapter of the book that for me it was easy. For me, there was no ideological or political transitions to make. I remained in my liberal secular clothing while I was writing the book, and while I was casting my own gaze, and while I was judging or withholding my judgment on him. But the more I read about him, the more I read of him, the more I read his diaries, I realized that the journey was far more difficult for him. He was the one who was a devout Hindu. He was the one who was deeply, deeply religious. And for him to make a transition from that kind of from those deep religion, from that deep sense of religiosity, to transition towards a sense of adopting a sense of civic nationhood or a civic ethos. And this is when I realized that rather than me casting a tolerant gaze on him, it was he actually who was demonstrating what it is for a devout Hindu to be tolerant. And that, I think, is the biggest takeaway from the book, that you can be a devout Hindu and yet make the transition towards keeping the public sphere sort of free from hatred and exclusion and negative feelings.
That is interesting. And I would like to pick up one part, right? That you feel as an outsider writing about your grandfather because of lack of memory of him, right? So that is very interesting because he is one of the significant figure in the politics, Indian freedom struggle. He was a member of the Constituent Assembly. Later, he was part of the Bihar legislature. Despite all this, it is very interesting that you have very less memory of him, right? And it's almost like your parents have never told you about or never spoken about Jagat Narayan Lal with you. So how did this memory missed?
there are different ways for the memory to be kept alive. For a memory to form, the memory has to be kept alive. It has to occupy a certain space in the collective sort of conversations and day-to-day memorialization by a family. And we were in this cosmopolitan town called Bokaro, and we were, in the sense, physically also removed from much of the family which was located in Patna. One of the reasons could be that I was physically away from the place where stories would be shared. But even during summer holidays or winter breaks, when I would be spending time with the family and we would all be together, uh, there was seldom a recounting of Jagat Narain Lal and his escapades. There was, the family seldom took pride in what he was. Part of the reason was that it was a difficult journey for the family. Unlike most families where it is only the male member who's in politics, my grandmother, Rampyari Devi, was also a very, very active member of the Congress. In fact, she participated in the Salt Satyagraha. She was in jail during the Quit India movement. She was a member of the Bihar Legislative Committee for almost 18 to 20 years. So she was leading an active political life, and she was my grandfather's second wife. And between the first wife and the second wife, there were 10 children. And so, of course, predictably, during the non-cooperation movement, he had he had given up his legal practice. So there was no steady source of income, so to say. There was neglect, there was financial troubles, there was penury, um, there was a feeling of constant deprivation that these children, both emotional and material, that Jagat Narain Lal's children felt. My bua, Pratima Verma, was a prolific writer, and she has published many short stories, as also a very small memo of my grandfather in Hindi. And she writes that it was almost as if we had lost our father to the nation. So those were the abiding emotions, and I don't think the children really cared to sort of replace those memories with other ones, because they did not have much of it in any case.
I mean, that is interesting. And one more question, right? You have spoken about your grandmother, Rampyari Devi, being a significant figure in the freedom struggle. And in your book's introductory chapter, she looms like a very large figure than Jagat Narayan Lal. But in the narrative, we miss her, right? So what happened?
Yeah. So, the first time, I really don't have a very good answer of why I have not dwelled more on her. Perhaps it was paucity of material. But my grandmother my dadi lived far longer than Jagat Narayan Lal. She was alive till 1978, and I have memory of her as a very stately lady, confident. There was always an air of authority. In fact, many people felt that she was more naturally attuned to being a politician than my grandfather, who was very soft and spiritual and less hard-headed. People were even scared of her. A lot of her political legacy is in fact unacknowledged. She could well be, her story could be recounted as one of the first wave feminist leaders. I first encountered her when I went to Teen Murti Bhavan, and I was surprised at the number of handwritten pages of Jagat Narayan Lal that was there in the archival section. And I went to the person, the librarian, and asked her, how did these papers come about? And she said that, I'll have to find out. And 2 days later, she told me that, it was Rampyari Devi who had come to Nehru Memorial Library and given those papers. A lot of those papers, of course, have been lost. They've been moth-eaten. They have been lost to termites and stuff. But I realized then that it had to be her. She was in politics. She was educated. She was She was alive to the idea that there is a legacy which needs to be restored and kept alive for posterity. Why is she missing from the book? Uh, Absence of stories, absence of reading material, absence of any record of her engagement. Primarily these two. And
I mean, in a way, certainly it is her leaving that material, keeping it safe and giving it to the archives is what
yes,
made this book
yes,
possible,
yes,
right?
yes,
So she's
yes,
like enabling figure for this particular work. Okay,
yes,
so now moving into Jagat Babu's life,
yes.
I think the first things which I found interesting is about his education, right? So to start the discussion about Jagat Narayan Lal's entry into the nationalist sphere, the first step is how did his education has shaped and laid foundation to his nationalist consciousness and also social service, right? Because he studied in missionary schools, and you say that his missionary zeal has worked on him, and at one point you quote in the book, I quote, the physicality of yoga and hockey that combine interestingly with the growing commitment to social service. Stop quote to Jagat Narayan Lal. So, how did his education has forged the nationalist consciousness and social service?
Yeah, so let me actually first acquaint you with what his commitment to education was. Uh, he himself was very educated. He had done a master's in, done a bachelor in law. He had a double degree, law and economics. He was a professor of economics at Bihar Vidyapeeth, which Mazharul Haq had set up. But very interestingly, and not very many people and not very many freedom fighters have done this, he set up the Jagat Narayan Lal College in 1960. And it's a constituent unit of the Patliputra University in Patna, Bihar. And this land was donated by Jagat Narayan Lal, um, who was then a cabinet minister. But very, very interestingly, this college was meant for education for the weaker sections of the society, and it was perhaps the only college imparting education up to graduation level in the semi-urban area. It was first affiliated to Bihar University, and later it has become part of Magad University, and the college is alive and kicking and functioning even today. Just recently, it was in the news that it needs more faculty induction. Jagat Narayan Lal also educated in a day and age where women's education was not very common. He educated all his five daughters till graduation, one of who became a writer, two became teachers, one trained in music. So everyone was, in a sense, educated and accomplished. Uh, um, and his commitment to, education remained steadfast in that sense. But I will not say how his education influenced his nationalist consciousness. If at all, his nationalist consciousness was rather shaped very ironically and interestingly by missionary activities that he saw. He was inspired by the principal of Ewing College in Allahabad, where he was studying, and the missionary zeal with which he carried on and the discipline with which he carried on his activities. He was also exposed to Annie Besant and the Theosophical Society and their work for spread of humanist consciousness. So it was more admiration for Christian missionaries, his principal at Ewing College, that his spirit of social service was awakened. And he writes also that, my spirit of social service was awakened due to my contact with professors and principals of Ewing College, who worked with such missionary zeal and so much sacrifice despite being from far off country like America. And then he says that, we should develop a similar missionary zeal for the propagation of our own dharma. So, in one sense, one of the roots of his his idea of seva and social service emanated from or originated from his admiration for Christian missionaries. And the other source, I think, is his deep knowledge of Vedanta philosophy, Advaita philosophy, and the inspiration he drew from the philosophy of Karma Yoga, particularly as enunciated in the Bhagavad Gita. So we can talk about that if you wish, and we can.
So this is interesting, right? He's actually studying in a missionary school, right? It's not only the Christian teachings, right, that he became, but he was also became with the Hinduism, and also he had a good command on Quran, right? So
Yes,
where did he learn Persian?
he was taught by a Maulvi when he was young. His primary education, it was very common for Maulvis actually to be going to homes of Hindu families and teaching them. And this is how this must have been his introduction to Persian.
We don't see these things nowadays,
Yes,
unfortunately, but it is fascinating, right? That how all these three religions, Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism, Jagat Narain was familiar with all of them. Now,
yes,
moving into the core contents of your text, right? So, your book you have basically divided into four parts, right? The trajectory of Jagat Narain Lal in the freedom struggle in the four parts. The
yeah.
first is that he was an ascetic nationalist. Second,
Mhm.
the Hindu nationalism. Third, the anti-colonial nationalism. And finally, the civic nationalism. So I would like to pick up ideas in all these four. Starting from
Mhm.
his early phase, he joined Congress Party and he was an integral part of the non-cooperation movement. And he was arrested during the non-cooperation movement for protesting against the visit of Prince of Wales in
Yes,
1921.
yes.
And in the jail is like awakening of his ascetic nationalism. So, and you speak about two ideas specifically. One is suffering and one is renunciation. Can you reflect on that phase?
Yes. So, uh, very interestingly, you will find an ascetic strand in many nationalist practices, Japan, for instance, and other parts of the world as well. Uh, the idea of asceticism actually draws from two interrelated strands of both renunciation and suffering. A renunciating body is also the one which is willing to suffer, willing to endure suffering. And Nietzsche makes a very interesting statement, which is a very interesting formulation. And he says, and which is there in the book also, that it is not suffering, but the senselessness of suffering, which is a curse. And Jagat Narayan also mentions a Sanskrit phrase. He says, Anukulam Vedniyam Sukham, that once suffering is made meaningful and purposive, the curse and the curse and the negative aspects and the suffering is made more tolerable. So I think he adopted the ascetic ethic to do basically two things. One was to, of course, make sense of his own suffering by attaching a cause, a reason, and so what he does, he attaches his own suffering to a higher cause. He rationalizes that his suffering is meant for the freedom of the nation, and he devotes himself to a higher cause. It's a duty to a cause higher than the self. Here, his ascesis or ascetic consciousness takes the shape of resistance to imperial subjugation. So, in sacrificing himself for the cause of the nation, Jagat Narayan Lal is actually fashioning a counter performance. He is not only training his body to endure suffering, but he is also telling the imperial colonialist that this body is so trained in enduring suffering that you cannot inflict more suffering on it. So it is a kind of counter performance. It is it is a bodily rejection of what pain or what harm a jail term can bring about, or suppression and oppression can bring about. The second aspect is, and the two are interrelated, one is suffering reasoned to a higher cause or suffering attached to a higher cause. And the second is unsettling and remaking of the old self. So a body that renounces desire naturally finds a higher reason for suffering. It also becomes a body that demonstrates the limits of coercive capacity of the state. So in that sense, these are twin tracks of an ascetic consciousness, whereby you train the body to endure suffering, but that endurance also trains you or also sends a message to the imperialists that you cannot subjugate me beyond a point.
Yes, this is yes.
Yeah.
Sorry,
There's
sorry.
just there's just one more related point. So, when we talk of an ascetic consciousness, we normally think that it is a suffering renouncing body. But what is interesting is that this suffering renouncing body is also a knowing self. It's also a knowing self that forges a relationship between the nation and the higher cause, and in this case, the nation that it sought to free. Another interesting stand, you imagine Jagat Narain Lal in the jail, and he is going through his routine of exercises, of pranayam, of meditation, of a whole series of activities that sort of practically trains him. So there is exercises, puja, meditation, pranayam. There is also renunciation, whereby he's training the body to practice moderation, temperance. He's quelling his own desire. And there is a third strand, which is that he's trying to link this to service to society, seva, and to the nation. Within the walls of the jail, he's also demonstrating to a whole community of fellow inmates that this is how an active ascetic this is what an active ascetic resistance looks like. And this then becomes not just Jagat Narain Lal's personal plight, but also the collective plight of the nation. It also depicts the collective plight of the nation. And in that sense, it builds a ascetic lore of resistance. It builds up a community, a strategy of resistance, if you will.
I mean, that is interesting because the idea that we get in our minds commonsensically when we see the word ascetic, right, and the word renunciation, right, it's like only for the self, sake of the self, right? But here he is transforming his ascetic self for the wider national cause. That is very interesting. And moving to the next strand, right, where his
Can I
ascetic,
just add
yes.
here? Can I just add here that Vivekanand here is Jagat Narayan Lal here is drawing a lot from Gita and Vivekanand, both who have been, mentioned in his memoir himself. And this draws directly from the Advaita philosophy, which is actually a philosophy of non-dualism, which says that every individual is but a manifestation of the absolute being. And if every individual is a manifestation if every Atma is a manifestation of Paramatma, then there is no distinction between one person and the other. And the other is the idea of salvation that Vivekanand very beautifully draws up when he says that the idea of karma yoga or the idea of moksha is not a self-centered idea of salvation in exclusion of society, but the idea of salvation is via the society. He says, you want to worship Shiva, worship the Daridra Narayan. You want to attain God, where else will you find but in the hutments and in the poor? So Vivekananda actually concretizes the idea of salvation via service to humanity. And he reconciles an extreme form of individualism with an idea of social justice and social service, and which is what informs even Jagat Narayan Lal.
That is interesting. Following from the same track, right? So, taking a wider form, right? He have associated himself with Hindu Mahasabha, right? After coming out from the jail. So, how did this happen? Like, why did he choose to initially associate with Hindu Mahasabha? And what is his vision, right? What factors actually guided him such association, and what he sought to achieve through such association?
So what guided him was first, of course, is his own deeply religious and spiritual nature. Politically, also, we have to understand the context. This is early 1920s. The non-cooperation movement has been suddenly withdrawn. There is widespread disenchantment with Gandhi's withdrawal of the non-cooperation. There has been a level of mobilization which has been whipped up. There is a certain nationalist energy which now doesn't know, which is seeking an outlet. And this is the time that Hindu Mahasabha, which did not have much of a presence in mainstream nationalist imagination, starts to reimagine itself, starts to revive itself. In another sense, the withdrawal of the non-cooperation also freed a number of leaders from the restraint of Gandhian ethics and morals. And therefore, membership to Hindu Mahasabha becomes a natural corollary. Since there was dual membership, people like Madan Mohan Malviya, Rajendra Prasad, many mainstream leaders, Jagat Narain Lal, actually take up dual membership in the absence of, in the aftermath of withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement. It also coincided with the end of the Khilafat movement. There was an open espousal of the Hindu cause, Hindu persecution in the aftermath of the Mopla rebellions by people like B.S. Monje. Then there is also an espousal of pan-Islamic aims. There are conversions which are happening. There are riots which are happening. The Kohat riot, the Mopla riots. And there is a growing feeling within a section of the right within the Congress that the Congress is not representing Hindu interests adequately, or even that it is being partial to Muslim interests. Another very interesting and ironical reason why this could have been why Jagat Narain Lal veered towards the Hindu Mahasabha is his admiration for political mentors like Gandhi, Madan Mohan Malviya, B.S. Monje, who in their own different and very conflictual ways convinced him that religion was not a contemptible pursuit in the field of religion, in the field of politics. So, the idea that religion and politics could be mixed seemed to be a fairly mainstream, fairly acceptable, fairly legitimate idea. And this, I think, becomes the broader set of reasons why Jagat Narain Lal actually joins the Hindu Mahasabha and becomes one of its foremost leaders. He became
This
the
is
All India
interesting.
Secretary in 1926.
No, this is interesting that we cannot separate religion and politics, but how we navigate through it becomes important. And that's where we can separate Jagat Narayan Ral's practices from what you write in book, from the vengeful Hindutva for the sake of empathetic Hindu nationalism. Here, I would put three words: Seva, Sangatan, and Shuddhi. And what these three words meant for the vengeful Hindutva is completely different from what it meant to Jagat Narayan Ral. He almost refashioned them, right? Can we reflect on all these three?
He tried to refashion them, but the lines often were so thin between political Hinduism and the spiritual Hinduism of Jagat Narayan Lal kind that they often actually merged one into the other. And one of the reasons why Jagat Narayan Lal actually is so tormented and tortured and feels as if he's walking on a thorny path, quote unquote, is because he never quite reconciled his own vision of what religion should be in politics and what it actually was. Take, for instance, the idea of seva. Now, seva actually is a religion neutral term. It actually means service to society. But very soon it becomes service to Hindu community. Right? The original idea of seva drew from karma yoga, the idea of purposive action, the idea of desireless action. It is tied to an alternative meaning of sannyas. So the religion-neutral idea of seva uh, which loosely implied service, welfare, social and constructive work, begins to serve and represent various Hindu interest groups and community positions. And they all gear up in different ways to the revivalist ideology of its key actors. So seva may have begun as a form of social work, but very soon the idea of seva becomes a Hindu practice, forging a conflation, as it were, of devotional and religious identity with the aims of the Hindu community, which again is conflated with the idea of the nation. Let me give you an example. So, for example, he was a member of the Bihar Provincial Seva Samiti, and as a member, he involved himself with the All India Gau Seva Mandal, and he organized an All India conference for expanding the work of Gauraksha. Then, even when he was a founder of the Hindustan Seva Sangh. But for Jagat Narain Lal, the call was always for a missionary attitude and spiritualization of public work. But he very soon finds that the ethic of seva that is being espoused by servants of the Hindu society, which was founded by, which was pioneered by B.S. Monje, it was it was politics by other means. However, this is not to say that Jagat Narain Lal himself was not concerned about representation of Hindu interests, which is why I say that the lines were very thin. He may have talked about spiritualization of politics and seva being a way to spiritualize politics, but it was also partial towards the representation of Hindu interests. He says that if the Theosophical Society and the Jamaat can represent their community interests, why can't Hindus represent their community interests? So it is, in a sense, this idea of seva, much that it claims to be a kind of spiritual activity, a kind of selfless social service, it becomes a way to crystallize the Hindu identity as well. It leads to the crystallization of Hindu identity and the idea of Hindu representation.
Can you reflect on the other two as well, the Sangathan and Shuddhi?
So, in the 20s, through the 20s, Jagat Narain Lal is touring. He goes to Assam with Lala Lajpat Rai. He also, as a member of the Hindu Mahasabha, is traversing through the Chota Nagpur region. He goes to Ranchi. And in all these regions, he sees a very heightened level of missionary activities and conversions which are happening. And these really trouble him. Now, what the counter to this was, he felt that Hindus are not organized. Hindus are a heterogeneous, divided, hierarchical group, community of people, and that they need to be united. They need to be homogenized. So Sangathan, which loosely means organization, is more an impulse for homogenization, unity, and reform, which is inspired by, as I mentioned earlier, the missionary zeal of the Christians. He mentions, there are two aspects of the missionary zeal which are very, very, he admires a lot, which is Prachar Shakti and Paddhati. Prachar Shakti means missionary activities, and Paddhati actually means organization. So he echoes B.S. Monje's call also, the need to unite, organize, and fortify. And he is committed to the goal of Sangathan. But interestingly, I did not find any references to Shuddhi. And all those historians like Papiya Ghosh have used these two terms actually as twinned concepts. I think that there is a case that can be made for decoupling these two concepts, Sangathan and Shuddhi. Sangathan means organization, and Shuddhi actually means reconversion, conversion back into the Hindu fold. I do not see a pitch for Shuddhi in Jagat Narain Lal. Sangathan, yes. And the trigger for Sangathan, as I mentioned, was, of course, one was conversion. The second was the Mopla riots, the Multan conversions. There were conversions, the Multan riots, conversions in Assam, Shillong and Sylhet regions in Assam, Jharkhand, modern day Jharkhand, actually, the Chota Nagpur region. And he felt that it was a deep tragedy of the Hindu community that they were so fragmented and they were so divided. And he sees Sangathan as an antidote and as a solution as a corrective to that.
Any, what do you think? Why he haven't picked up Shuddhi as an idea? Why wasn't that not much seen in his work?
Um, I mean, I can only sort of extrapolate. His concern was not to repopulate the Hindu fold. His concern was actually to reform the Hindu community so that its reformist avatar was good enough, was inclusive enough, was equal enough, was egalitarian enough, was reformist enough to keep the flock together. It is perhaps a difference in concern. And since there is, I also think that Jagat Narayan Lal's Hinduism is not a very politicized Hinduism. So his idea is not to increase the plebiscitary volume of the Hindu community. Perhaps it is that. I can only speculate on what.
Yes. One more thing that we have to discuss is in his second phase as a Hindu nationalist is that he was a member of both Congress Party and Hindu Mahasabha. And there is a developing of a gap between both these organizations, and he's trying to put his feet in the two, right? At one point in your book, you write, I quote, for him, the mutuality of the relationship between the Congress and the Hindu Mahasabha was important. And as that went down, so did his relationship with the Hindu Mahasabha. Stop quote. So, how did he solve this dilemma of being a member of both Mahasabha and Congress Party?
To understand this, we have to understand that there are two essential aspects of Jagat Narayan Lal's ideology, political philosophy. One is his spiritual Hinduism, political Hinduism, the cause of Hinduism that he espouses. And the other is the cause of nationhood, free nationhood that the Congress was fighting. He makes a distinction in his head between cultural practices and political practices. And his hope always was that his association with Hindu Mahasabha was to enable a better representation for Hindus in the public sphere. So he is wanting a cultural, he also tells B.S. Monji that can we restrict the activities of servants of Hindu society and the Hindustan Seva Sangh to cultural activities. So in his head, in his imagination, his association with Hindu Mahasabha was for Seva and Sangathan to organize and to reform the Hindu community and to work for the benefit and Seva of the Hindu community. But as far as the project of nationhood was concerned, he was staunchly and firmly and consistently in the Congress camp. So he is with the Hindu Mahasabha till a point that he feels that a mutuality of relationship can be established. But the moment he feels that actually, and this is when Bhai Parmanand takes over in the early 30s, that actually the Hindu Mahasabha is increasingly becoming pro-government and anti-Congress, he parts ways with the Hindu Mahasabha. And the parting begins in 1933 in the aftermath of the communal award. And Nehru reaches out to Jagat Narayan Lal and Madan Mohan Malviya in the mid-30s. Jagat Narayan Lal has become a member of Madan Mohan Malviya's party. But 1937 elections, he fights on the Congress ticket. and with a lot of pleasure, he notes in his memoir that the opposing candidate who from Hindu Mahasabha also lost his deposit. So by 1937, the break is almost complete. That said, uh, Jagat Narayan Lal, you could take Hindu Mahasabha out of Jagat Narayan Lal, but you could not, that did not mean the end of religious uh, predilections in Jagat Narayan Lal.
That is very interesting. Your last point is very interesting, and I think here I would like to. I think you can recall this of this incident in 1947 when Jagat Narayan Lal is traveling in train, a conversation between Syed Muhammad and Jagat Narayan Lal. Would you like to
Yeah,
recall that? Would you like to tell the story?
yeah, yeah. So, so he's traveling. This is a story. I really have no way of checking the veracity of this story, and this is a story which has been recounted by my uncle, Sushil Chandralal, and he says that in the early years of independence, Ranchi used to be the summer capital. Ranchi is at a height, little bit of a height, 1,000 feet or so. So they are traveling from Patna to Ranchi, and there is a debate on the Gita and the Quran, which starts in the train. He's traveling with B.N. Azad, who's the editor of Indian Nation, and Said Mahmood, who's a senior leader and a member of the Krishna Sinha committee. And but it was not the expository roles were not as one would expect. It was actually Jagat Narayan Lal who was holding forth on Quran in Persian, and it was Syed Mahmood who was talking about the Gita. And as my uncle says that the next day the headlines of the Indian Nation stated Maulana Jagat Narayan Lal debates with Pandit Syed Mahmood. So yeah, that's one of my favorite stories that I heard about
That
my grandfather.
that I mean, for me also in the complete book, like that is one of the favorite snippet, right? That I would like to widely recall and tell people. Now, he completely broke away from Hindu Mahasabha, but he's still a deeply spiritual person and a Hindu in all the ways. But in that phase, he have asked for an undivided India, right? So can you explain that part? What is this imagination of an undivided India?
I'll just go back to your earlier question and just make one small point. See, the break with Hindu Mahasabha is significant because, if nothing else, it underscores an aspiration for a public life of spiritual Hinduism that is not located in hatred or exclusion. And Jagat Narayan Lal draws a distinction between, in his own sort of conflict and ridden way, between political and spiritual Hinduism. It's a thin line, and yet a line that is probably worth preserving. For Jagat Babu, being a Hindu was always a very self contained, reflexive idea of defining oneself in relation to the cosmic whole. He does flirt with the idea of representation of Hindus, of political Hindu, representation of a collective Hindu identity, but he eventually admits to both the folly and the futility of it. And his biggest disenchantment with Hindu Mahasabha is with the failure of political Hinduism to imagine and construe a politics that was distinctly and consistently anti-colonial. And one of the main reasons why he breaks away from Hindu Mahasabha is because from being being an anti-colonial, or from uh, um, it becomes a pro-government organization. And in one place, actually, he's writing a letter to B.S. Monji, and he actually compares Hindu Mahasabha to Muslim League. And he says, I did not realize that one day the Hindu Mahasabha would behave like the Muslim League. And, the implication here is that it would collaborate with the British government for its own narrow sectarian political gains. Uh, so he doesn't give up the idea of Hindu representation, of being a Hindu, devout Hindu. He adopts the ethic of civic nationalism without being religion neutral. And that has a series of contradictions also permeate his own politics because of that. Uh, your question on undivided India, uh, this is the time when Jagat Narain Lal has realized the folly of Hindu nationalism, and he has realized that political representation of a collective Hindu identity is something that is not possible in a country like India. And politics is not a sphere where his spiritual Hinduism is going to find either an outlet or a representation. So he pitches his tent with the Congress and its idea of civic nationalism. And despite many differences with the Congress with respect to the communal award, with respect to many positions of Congress leaders, whether it was C. Rajgopalachari in 1942, whether it was Gandhi in 1945, he stays with Congress and the idea of civic nationhood. And there is a reason why I'm saying, because this idea of civic nationhood is a far more inclusive idea, and it includes Muslim identity, if not as much, but to a degree that it permitted the vision and imagination of a united India. The idea of undivided India was basically against partition, and this sort of fructified in the aftermath of the Cripps mission. The Cripps proposal actually proposed a dominion status for India, but it also granted any state or any territorial unit the right to secede. So what happens is that the Cripps proposal is, of course, defeated. Congress does not adopt it. But C. Rajgopalachari brings the Madras resolution to Allahabad at the AICC meet. And here his proposal is that the Cripps proposal should be accepted and should be dwelled upon by the Congress. It was in support of the Cripps proposal. In opposing Rajgopalachari's proposal was Jagat Narain Lal resolution, which was an anti-Pakistan resolution, ruled out liberty to any component state or territorial unit to secede, the right of any component state or territorial unit to secede. So this was one aspect. This was the sort of political happenings around at that time. But the deeper reason was a realization by Jagat Narain Lal that it was not race, it was not language, it was not even common historical antecedents, but it was a will of all communities to come together and form a nation. And in India, he felt that this will was depicted, or this will manifested in the anti-colonial struggle, where people of different communities, Hindu, Muslim, Sikhs, Marathas, Bengalis, Biharis, Odiyas, tribals, peasants, labor, all came together in a sort of united platform for a united struggle. And this was the common will, and this he thought would become the basis of a united India.
How did he react to partition, right? Any ideas of that?
He's so we have to understand that Quit India movement has ended. Almost all the leaders have been jailed. Jagat Narain Lal actually has been jailed for 3 years of rigorous imprisonment. It is at that time that he receives the news of a rapprochement between Gandhi and Rajaji. And the news that Rajaji's proposal is once again being considered by not just by Gandhi but by the Congress as well. This is the time that even Nehru is in jail. And he is very, very troubled by it in jail. And he feels disturbed, he feels cheated, he feels that Gandhi is not in a position to take this decision in the absence of leaders. He feels that he doesn't have the mandate actually to overrule his own resolution, which had been passed by overriding majority. So he's troubled, he's intensely troubled by the fact.
So the partition of India would have surely broken his heart, but he did not leave the Congress party or anything, and he still chose to stay in the Congress party and was an active member in the post-independent Indian politics, and also a member of Constituent Assembly. And he began his phase, the fourth phase and final phase of his nationalism, which is the civic nationalism. Now, before we talk about Jagat Narain's ideas in this phase, one thing I want to discuss is in the beginning of your chapter, you point out that in the Constituent Assembly, one issue that was hugely debated, other than the language issue, is about the word secular. And you have given a distinction in the chapter about why did you choose to use the word civic nationalism and not secular nationalism? Like, it's very interesting. Could you please reflect on it?
Yes, you're right. Secular nationalism actually is a term that is hotly debated in the Constitution, whether it was the insertion of "in the name of God," whether it was, and there are people like H.V. Kamath, Shibanlal Saxena, Govind Malviya, who want the insertion of Jagat Narain Lal, who want the insertion of "in the name of God" in the preamble of the Constitution. There are many who are against, but with every word that reflected a certain religious predilection, there was a debate, whether it was, inclusion of the word Bharatvarsh or India, whether it was the inclusion of the word secular in the preamble. There was it was hotly debated. One of the reasons for this debate, before I go on to my own choice, was because it was felt that that the public sphere of India, unlike in the West, was marked by very deeply felt religious identities. Religion was performed in the public sphere, whether it was in the festivals, whether it was in. So religion was not just a private sphere, not just restricted to the private sphere, but dharma or religion was as much a part of the public sphere as it was the private sphere. It was, in a sense, the core identity of Hindus. That was one. The second, it was felt that dharma in Indic philosophy or in Hindu philosophy did not really indicate religion. It was more to do with righteous action. It was more to do with ethics, and to expect that politics would be conceptualized or imagined in the absence of ethics was also repugnant to many constitution makers, which is why there was a resistance to including the word secular. But it did not mean that we chose to be unsecular. We granted, the Constitution of India granted everyone the right to practice, propagate, and profess religion. So we chose to be a secular constitution. It's just that we did not describe ourselves as secular. Now, the reason why I chose the word civic nationalism is one, of course, India did not describe itself as secular, and that reason is telling. It is not accidental that we did not choose to be. It indicated that the religious differences and the cultural identities and the religious identities could not be reconciled in a language of equal rights. All right. So, which is why I prefer to use the term civic nationalism, which I feel has a far lesser ambition. And that said, even the word civic nationalism or civic identity, nationhood, is not used in the Constitution. So the civic idea of nationalism has a sort of lesser ambition. It has a lighter burden to bear than its loftier cousin, secular nationalism. And perhaps its greatest merit lies in the fact that it shifts focus from a stance on religion to that on rights. And in a multi-religious, multi-ethnic, the civic idea allows for a certain latitude to function maximally through cooperation, respect for diversity and difference, or minimally through toleration. And in the end, it was an it was a resolve. The idea of civic nationalism or the idea of civic nationhood is actually a resolve. It's a resolve, it's a dispassionate idea that disparate, different, diverse groups of people have come together and agreed to abide by a set of shared principles. Right? That's number one. Number two, there is a principle of non-coercion that underlies it. And number three, there is a principle of non-discrimination that underlies it. So a set of shared principles, non-coercion, non-discrimination. And this is what largely our constituent assembly values, sort of, if you distill the values of the constituent assembly, these are the ones that percolate down rather than secularism. And the reason why I say rather than secularism is because the Indian state did not end up being secular in the prototypical Western sense of the term. Eventually, the idea that prevailed is that the state agreed to be equidistant from all religions. But even that idea is fraught. How can you be equidistant from all religions and give minorities special rights? How can you be equidistant from all religions and try and curb majoritarian excesses? Right? So there is equidistance does not permit for either curtailing majoritarian excesses or for protective discrimination rights, which is why our secularism or even the idea of equidistance is just so fraught. It's just so open to different interpretations, to manipulated meanings and imaginations.
I think here I would like to discuss, because we are anyway talking about the equidistant from religion. Jagat Narain was actually against trying to propagate religion. Can you explain us that?
So he felt, and he cites the example of Irish Constitution, he cites the example of Swiss Confederation, he cites the example of Soviet Union, and he says that when religions are different, or when religions behave differently in the public sphere, a non-proselytizing religion like Hinduism is actually at a disadvantage from religions that are proselytizing and that permit conversions. And he felt that if at all the ethic of equality of religion has to be respected, then we have to place all religions at an equal platform. And that equality doesn't mean that you get different religions to compete when the field itself is sort of uneven. So he's against propagation of religion because he feels that proselytizing religions like Islam and mainly Christianity would actually dent Hinduism and the Hindu community. It would encroach upon Hindu identities and it would dent the Hindu community.
One of the important things in his phase of civic nationalism is an idea which he have said, which is the idea of forgetfulness, right? In your book, you quote Jagat Narain Ral. I quote, "Instead of being united by common historical antecedents, the past of the Hindus and Muslims is a past of mutual animosities and destruction, both in the political as well as in the religious fields. The prospects might perhaps be different if the past of the two communities can be forgotten by both. Hence, the importance of forgetfulness as a factor in building a nation." I think this is, stop quote, I think this is very, very important idea. Can you reflect on it?
So according to Jagat Narain Lal, he is acutely aware of the fractious past between the Hindus and Muslims. And he feels that the two communities may never really forget or obliterate their past because their past is embedded in their religion. And for them to give up their past is to give up their religion. So rather than rather than a contest where one party is made to give up their past, and by implication, he thinks it would be tantamount to giving up of religion. It is important to forget the past. Hence the importance of forgetfulness in the task of nation building. So the two warring parties, the onus of forgetfulness, or onus of forgetting rather, is on both the parties, so that we can move forward in the shared project of nation building. Reconciliation is something that he feels is not something that can be achieved, and which is why he talks about forgetfulness and the importance of forgetfulness in the project of nation building.
It is actually very interesting to see how Jagat Narain will transition through all the four phases for the wider cause of the nation, right? Either in the ascetic phase, or in the Hindu nationalist phase, or in the anti-colonial phase, or finally the civic nationalism. Now, I would like to move to the present, right? Which you have actually reflected in your last chapter. How do you think the present regime has actually transformed all these four idioms of nationalism for its purposes? And how do you think it has undermined both the foundational principles of the Indian Republic, and how Jagat Babu have traveled through these?
So there are four nationalist idioms that are outlined in the book, and these are idioms that can be distilled from the Indian national movement. The first is that of ascetic nationalism, the second is that of Hindu nationalism, the third is that of anti-colonial nationalism, and the fourth of civic nationalism. In a sense, one of Hindutva's success stories, modern day contemporary Hindutva success stories, has been that it has postured itself as a national movement that is regenerating the cultural, spiritual, and political core of Indian nation. So this posturing of Hindutva as a national movement has resulted in Hindutva not just appropriating nationalist mascots like Mahatma Gandhi, Sardar Patel, but it has also resulted in it appropriating the various nationalist idioms of the freedom movement. So let me take the example of the ascetic consciousness. So we have routinely seen the Prime Minister in his election rallies and otherwise as well posture himself as a samanya vyakti, ordinary man, somebody from OBC, Pichra Parivar, or a chokidar, or a pradhan sevak, or a fakir. These are all languages, these are all words and epithets that convey the idea of a simple, selfless, a man who has renounced all his personal desires and interests for the cause of the nation. Whether it is the idea of a fakir who is fighting on behalf of the nation against corruption, or it is somebody who is ordinary from the backward caste. It is all the ascetic, the idea that the Prime Minister is unattached to family, material possessions, or even unattached to power, is something that is routinely fed via the social media to our collective consciousness. In 2014 and 19, I think the opposition candidate was routinely projected as Shehzada, as a prince who was privileged and who was entitled and who had it all. And in contrast was Prime Minister Modi, who was a fakir and an ascetic. He appropriates the saintly idiom of Indian politics, so to say. The second idiom of Hindu nationalism today, has a new life as Savarkar's Hindutva. It is practiced today as RSS Hindutva. And it takes its foundational thesis from Savarkar's Hindutva, but it converts itself into a high modernist ideology that takes the potent mix of nationalism, techno-development, formal democracy, and combines it with a singular idea of Hinduism into one potent mixed entity, one potent entity called Hindutva. And, in the end, it just becomes one massive faith creating exercise that employs multiple rationalizations for its reproduction and its continued exercise. So there is a mix of nationalism, technology, formal democracy, and that is fused with Hinduism to give us this potent mix called Hindutva. We have seen several enunciations of this in the public sphere. For instance, Mohan Bhagwat has said, everyone living in India is a Hindu. It is different from Savarkar, who said Muslims do not have a natural right to this country because their holy land is different. But Mohan Bhagwat tweaks it because we are living under contemporary conditions of a secular democracy. So there is a tweaking of Hindutva that is needed. And instead of Muslims cannot live in India and are not natural citizens of India, it is now all Indians who are living in India, everyone living in India is a Hindu. Now, for everyone living in India, there has to be one Hinduism. And I want to focus on this quest for singularity that seeks this quest for singularity, this quest for uniformity, which really marks the project of Hindutva, and which really underlines that being Hindu is the only legitimate and rightful way to be in this Hindu land. Now, what this does is, at one level, you could say that this is a benign assertion that Hindu actually is not a religious identity, it is a geocultural identity, as the Sangh routinely reminds us. But what it does is, in our collective psyche, it renders other ways of being as alien, as suspicious, as treacherous, as unauthentic. And this is the bread butter idea of Hindutva and illegitimacy of other religio-cultural ways of being in India. And the CAA 2019 is a point in case. The third idiom is that of anti-colonial nationalism. That has been replaced in modern times by the idea of internal enemies. So whether it is the libtards, whether it is the seculars, whether it is Muslims, whether it is the cow traders, whether it is the urban Naxals, there is an entire breed of anti-nationals who need to be, who are marked as enemies of the state. Anti-nationalism today has become a routinely used term to label any kind of dissenter, any kind of political, any genre of political opposition, any person who's a dissenter, who dissents with Hindutva politics. And here I want to point out that nationalism can be conceptualized and fashioned either in terms of its own aspirational values, like it was in early years of independence. India aspired to become a nation, a modern secular nation. So it can either be conceptualized in terms of its own aspirational values of nationhood, or in terms of a majoritarian consolidation against one traitorous enemy or the other. Right? And modern day Hindutva actually appropriates the anti-colonial idiom by locating internal enemies and fashioning its nationalism as an opposition to this internal enemy. The enemy of the nation, is the internal seditious anti-national enemies of the state. These are, and you will routinely find expressions of these in social media, in utterances of members of legislative assembly, the Home Minister, of of Sangh members, of members of Parliament. You will very often hear this. I mean, the favorite term of "go to Pakistan" is one of those uh, refrains which have permeated our the way we oppose somebody, and the prescriptions that we give to somebody who we oppose. Um, so the fourth idiom is actually, the appropriation of the fourth idiom is the most interesting. Now, the foundational idea of civic nationhood is actually equality. Equality, equal rights-bearing citizens are the foundational foundation of civic nationhood. What contemporary politics does, or what contemporary politics of Hindutva does, or Hindutva nationalism does, is actually take the idea of equality and invert it to suppress minority and lesser privileged identities. So, for example, we have the agenda of uniform civil code, underlined by an idea of equality. We have the Muslim practice of triple talaq, which has been outlawed, underlined by an idea of gender equality, as also inter-community marriage law equality. We have the legitimacy and legality of state-funded minority institutions being brought into question, again underlined by an idea of equality. So the idea of reservations has been a more sticky one for Hindutva nationalism, because they cannot disavow it given the nature of electoral politics. But there is also a underlying subtext of opposition or discomfort with the idea of reservations. Again, this discomfort is undergirded by an idea of equality, that everybody should be equal, and equally meritorious people should be. So the inversion of the idea of equality, I think, is the most cunning, the most effective, and the most legitimate of all. It allows Hindutva nationalism to posture itself as democratic, as secular, and yet it is able to fulfill its objectives of an exclusive kind of nationalism.
I think, picking up from what you have just said, how the four idioms of nationalism held by Jagat Babu is now kind of overturned by the Hindu nationalist regime. Um, what lessons of Jagat Babu's life will become relevant for us to counter such subversions?
I'll just make a small amendment to something that you said. These are not Jagat Babu's four idioms. As I've said in the book, Jagat Babu actually embodied these four idioms in his own person as also in his political practice. So these are nationalist idioms that have, that were practiced, and the pathways that were walked by Jagat Narain Lal. One of the first lessons, it's always difficult to draw lessons from a historical figure, but I would say Jagat Narain Lal was a deeply religious person. And there is a lesson for every person who's deeply religious, that if you look towards politics for representation of your spirituality, for the representation of your religiosity, that is unlikely to happen. What is practiced in the public sphere, what is practiced in the political sphere, is a political form of Hinduism. It is a form of political Hinduism that is mobilizing your religiosity for political gains. The nationalist aims are gains which are couched in terms of religion, but at the end of the day, religion is an instrument. It instrumentalizes religion for political gains. I think this was a realization that Jagat Narain Lal reached in his life. He was not able to shed his religiosity completely, but he was able to at least pursue a imagination and a practice of nationhood that was more inclusive. Equal citizenship. He was able to profess, practice, and even debate argue for an idea of citizenship that was located in birth, in descent, as well as in naturalization. Unlike a modern idea of Hindutva, which is more exclusionary in nature and which de facto, if not de jure, excludes many communities, minority communities, from its larger vision and version of both Hinduism and Hindu nationhood. Jagat Narain Lal, even in his most Hindu nationalist of phases, even in those phases when he's espousing Hindu nationalism in its most exclusionary way, is never a proponent of Hindu Rashtra. So the lesson that we can draw is perhaps that religion and politics need to be kept separate, if not from the public sphere, at least from the political sphere.
Separating religion from the public sphere and keeping it a private affair. I think with that note and with many messages, we will end this conversation here. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for taking your time.
Thank you, Rishi. Thank you for having me.